And there's a view from the cockpit, something a little bit different. The remains of Nicholas just off to our east, but looking off that way, don't really see any sign of that, just more of this flat, squashed cumulus field. There's a look at our weather picture for this Friday afternoon, showing the remains of Nicholas. That was a hurricane that drifted north along the Texas coast, moved inland, and has been lingering out in Louisiana and Mississippi over the past few days. And maximum sustained winds on that 15 miles an hour, so not very much left of that. We also have this new tropical storm. I did not have a chance to paint that as a tropical storm because this news just came in. However, it is moving to the north and should remain off the coast of New England over the next couple days. Further to the north, an outbreak of polar air coming into the northern plains, pushing this front into Chicago, Des Moines, and approaching Topeka. The tail end of that front bringing some cool, windy weather to the Texas Panhandle, but this is a dry system, so we're not seeing any thunderstorm development out in that region. And we do have the dry line starting to make an appearance out there on the Caprock, extending down towards Sanderson. The tail end of that cold front extending into the central Rockies and into the Great Basin area. Temperatures rather cool in Nevada, 70s. And in just a few weeks, we're going to start seeing the normal overnight lows dropping to freezing. That's a cold desert there. And as we get through these shorter and shorter days going into October, we're going to lose a substantial amount of radiation at nighttime, and that means very cool evenings in that part of the country. In the Pacific Northwest, we've got this system in Washington, very rainy, murky day. We can see 54 there at Seattle. That's quite a change from 2 months ago when we had 90s in that region. Barraclough high in the northern plains driving that front south, and that's just about it around the country except for this messy tropical convection from Florida up towards the remains of Nicholas. Our obligatory look at the North Pacific and Alaska, showing substantial cold air advection. Look at that, 30s and 40s. And we're not talking about the North Slope, we're talking about the interior of Alaska. We got 45 there, just north of Anchorage, and that cold air flowing off the Aleutians, off of Kodiak and the Kenai Peninsula into the northern Pacific. And you can see that bullseye right there, 540 decameters. This is a huge chunk of cold air flowing into the North Pacific. Similar story in the central and eastern part of Canada. Cold air in place from the Arctic region into the taiga area of Canada. And that cold air is going to be flowing south in some areas, not quite there in Alberta and Saskatchewan, where we have return flow. But we're going to have to start watching for some of this cold air to work southward, because between the high Arctic, Alaska, and the North Pacific, there's substantial amounts of cold air north of 50 latitude. So at some point, it's probably going to work into parts of the U.S. over the next week or two. Now, one way we can size this up is to look at the 300 millibar hemispheric chart. This paints out the polar vortex. And right now, there's no clear polar vortex. It's divided up into a number of centers. So there's probably about 6 of them. And if you average all of them out, you're going to get kind of a vague low pressure area right there. And that's the polar vortex itself. Now, surrounding that, we've got the polar jet. It's strong in some areas, such as the North Pacific, Canada, and way out there around Kazakhstan. But if we roll this forward, we can see how the pattern changes. And what we see here, a large number of waves. There's one right there, 2, 3, 4, 5, and maybe 6. So with that many waves, the whole pattern is going to progress west to east. And as a result, we get waves moving across much of the U.S., bringing in their wake high pressure, high heights, warming, and then flip-flopping back to cooler and cloudier weather. Now, one thing that pops up later next week is this band of very strong winds out in the Pacific. We can see that that's about 140 knots. So that's some impressive energy out there. That's typically something that we see in the wintertime. And when we have that kind of energy, especially long and zonal like that, there's tremendous opportunity to knock cold air from the Arctic regions into the eastern, central, and sometimes the western U.S. And I think, at least the GFS is indicating that once we get this ridge building up, some of that cold air will come south around September 30th and October 1st. But that's 340 hours out. A lot could change between now and then. However, Europe, look at that. They've got their own fetch of long upper level flow. And that ends up driving cold air south into Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. That's it right there. To them, if you rotated the map, that would be very strong northwesterly flow. And that tends to be very cold and sometimes brings some wintry weather, especially in Norway, Scotland, and parts of England. It's probably a little bit too early for wintry weather, but there's also areas that are going to be unusually warm. Take a look at the ascending part of that jet right there. You can see that building up into Greenland. So very likely kind of a warm pattern there, maybe a storm track, atmospheric river perhaps coming up into Greenland and Iceland. So they could get some unusually wet and warm weather, depending on how that plays out. Also, atmospheric river could be tapping into the Pacific Northwest later in the month with that troughing there. Another fetch possible here into British Columbia. So we're going to be looking at quite a bit of weather coming up during the second half of this month. And checking in at NHC, Tropical Storm Odette has just popped up. 35 knots on that, 1010 millibars. So that is not deep at all. But that will be making a beeline for the area just south of Newfoundland. And that should be out of the picture over the weekend. Now, a little bit of confession. I have been caught a few times mispronouncing storm names. So hopefully that storm name is not Odette or Odette. I'm going to say that's Odette. And the 5-day outlook, well, this is the area of concern we were talking about on Wednesday. I can see that NHC has adjusted that north of the Leeward Islands. So I think that kind of takes the Gulf Coast out of the picture, and our area of concern is more for the northeast U.S. This is kind of like shades of October and November. We've got the cold air up to the north, and we've got the storms taking more of a recurving northward track, putting New England under the gun. Checking in on the Storm Prediction Center desk. Wow, looks like maybe we do have a chance of storms in the panhandles. Just off the Cap Rock, you can see nothing's developed, but that is positioned pretty much right along that front that we drew earlier, and it's kind of near the triple point and the northern part of that dry line. Let's take a look at that one more time. Yeah, there it is. That slight risk is pretty much right in that area there. Now here's a very useful graphic. This is mixing ratio, which is basically moisture similar to dew point, and theta, which is essentially temperature normalized to a common level. Now looking at the red, that's going to be basically your isotherms. So we can use that to outline the front. And it appears that it is running something like that. And we also see a wave out there in Kansas. And then superimposed on that, the green hatched areas outlined by the dashed blue lines, indicates the moisture field. So the moisture axis is running about like that, flowing north through western Oklahoma, right there into that wave. So if I was going to chase on a day like this, I'd probably want to venture up into southwest Kansas, because very likely your stuff further down the line is going to be affected more by mixing of dry air into the parcels. You can see that weaker appearance of the moisture field. And we would also look at the satellite. You can see those ingredients right there. Remember, the front was running about like this, and we had the moisture advection flowing up like that, and you can see where it impinges on the frontal boundary. We've got some vertical towers. There they are right there. Nothing huge, but it does look like the cumulus field is percolating right there in that tongue of moisture. Now, my own digital atmosphere program is very useful for looking at Mesonet data. So there it is. That definitely fills in some gaps. Some data is withheld by some Mesonet operators. That's very regrettable, because some of this data really should be shared. Looking at the plots, I'm seeing the front running about like that. I can see it has not quite emerged out towards Canadian or Memphis. Look at that, 96 there at Memphis, 91 at Canadian, and 97 out around, I guess that would be Paducah. So some very warm air right off the cap. Yeah, okay, 99. 100 anybody? Okay. So the front is going to be running about like that, and that puts the, well, we don't have very many plots, but a lot of the better moisture is certainly flowing up in that area. And along the caprock, weaker moisture values, 50s and lower 60s dew points. And you also have the benefit of the backed winds right here. So if storms do get going, they'll have a better chance of organizing due to the better low-level shear. And there could certainly be a few strong storms out there in northwestern Oklahoma. Pretty cloudy in the southwestern U.S. You can see we've got southerly flow, and looks like one stout wildfire there east of Bakersfield. We can see on the 500 millibar flow that we've got south flow opening up into the southwestern U.S. And obviously they're not underneath a big ridge. That's over New Mexico. So with this increase in upper level flow, moisture coming northward in the mid-levels, that's given us a little bit of elevated convection through that part of the country. In the Pacific Northwest, wow, we've got frontal bands moving into the Portland area. So a change in the weather definitely on the way. A better way to look at that is on the infrared imagery. Yep, that's a huge baroclinic system offshore. And in the wake, this is a large area of cold air advection associated with that cold air spilling south out of Alaska. We don't often look at central Canada, but we can see cold air advection cumulus and stratocumulus from Winnipeg eastward. And then on the other side, we can assume that Saskatchewan is in an area of high pressure and return flow as you go west. In the southeastern U.S., there's the remains of Nicholas. Not much left of it, but it's acting very much like a tropical depression wandering around the southeastern U.S., and we got this very extensive convective cloud field. In the northeastern U.S., we have Odette. You can see a little backdoor front right there in the Carolinas and Virginia. Some of that cold air coming southward and impinging on southerly flow from the south. So we get this convergent zone, and that helps develop the thunderstorms in that region. Also, a couple convective bands feeding up into Odette, located right there. And then just a quick look at Quebec. Frontal system, warm air advection, mild conditions right around there. cold front and frontal wave. And then on the other side, we've got the cold air advection coming in from the west. And it looks like a few showers and maybe weak thunderstorms with cold rain right there over the muskeg regions of Ontario. That air mass certainly quite cold, 50s in that region, but what's happening is we've got very cold air in the mid and upper levels working over that region. So you get cold over warm, which is the textbook definition of instability. So we have heightened instability right there over Ontario, and the result from that, some weak thunderstorms, maybe some cold rain, and maybe even a bit of grapple mixed in. And this is what we're talking about here, 700 millibars up at about 10,000 feet, temperature by the color coding, and the winds. And this is the region that's very convective, and you can see the cold air very close at hand there, and those are some very cold amounts. Looks like -8 to -10 Celsius. We can bring up a sounding, and we can see a very steep lapse rate from the surface all the way up to about 600 millibars, which is about 14,000 feet. So the instability, not huge. The capes are not very high. However, it's definitely enough to generate showers and storms. And then just to close off, we'll take a look at the week ahead. I'm not going to go all the way to October 1st. It is advertising a lot of cold air coming south, but we'll just have to wait and see on that. But in the short term, strong Pacific system moving through the northern Rockies into the Great Basin area. Return flow in Texas all the way up towards Minnesota. So pretty nice weekend for the central U.S. A lot of that Pacific air moves into the central plains by Monday and all the way through Las Vegas. So they're going to have an early front pass through on Monday. So that's a good chunk of cold air right there, and it's enough to set off an MCS from Ontario all the way down towards Arkansas for Monday night. The cold front settles in all the way to Texas and stalls out. Some storms going up around Tuesday and Wednesday, all the way from the Great Lakes down to Louisiana. And it looks like that cold air mass clears much of the eastern U.S. So that's going to bring us an early fall pattern around the 22nd and 23rd. And of course, it's looking like a possibility of a stronger reinforcement about 5 days after this. But we'll just wait and see on that because the GFS accuracy degrades significantly past the 200-hour point. So we'll just leave that for next week's Forecast Lab. Anyway, no new Patreon supporters this week. Our last one was Hank Dolan from September 3rd. And a letter from Tristan R. He says, Canadian weather is always welcome for those of us that live there. Very interesting to hear about it. Well, thank you for that message, Tristan, and hope everybody has a great weekend. Have a good one, and we'll see the supporters here on Monday and everybody else on Wednesday. Take care. Bye-bye.